More minutes. Welcome, everybody. This is BJ Urban with the PIA MidAmerica office. Many of you I know, and to those of you I don't, I hope I get to know you soon. I'm the Director of Education and Technology for PIA MidAmerica, and today we're proud to be partnering with Kirkpatrick Price to bring this program to you on data security. Just briefly, before we get started though, a little housekeeping. As you probably all have figured out by now, you're all in a mute status so that we can keep integrity of the recording for this event. It is being recorded. You will all get a notification for the link for that recording. To ask questions today, you have on the dashboard, there's an area there to the lower right where you can type in your questions or comments, and those will be addressed by our speaker in the Q&A session at the end of the program. And just briefly, just quickly to tell everybody a little bit about PIA America. Some of you know this and some of you might not, that PIA MidAmerica was actually founded in late 19th century when printers in Kansas City and San Antonio, we're talking like 1887 and 1895, thought an organization to support the printing industry would be valuable, and they did so. And then as the economies grew, organizations developed in Oklahoma City, Fort Worth, Dallas, Wichita, Kansas, Amarillo, and Austin. And then as time went along, it all became consolidated into what we have today as PIA MidAmerica. And we strive to continually seek out educational programs and events and opportunities for our members and for the graphic industry as a whole. And we also provide a wide range of business and industry-specific services. So feel free to visit us anytime, PIAMidAmerica.org, or just give us a call. And so that's enough about me, PIA, at this point. Again, welcome everybody. It's now my pleasure to thank everyone at Kirkpatrick Price who helped make this program possible, and to introduce our speaker, Todd Stevenson, Vice President of Kirkpatrick Price. Todd, take it away.
Thank you, BJ, and we want to appreciate the opportunity to be invited to speak with your members today, and hopefully we can bring some value to the conversation today. So, you know, our topic is what is SSAE 16 and why am I being asked about it? And this is a common question that I get from every week. I have this question: what is SSAE 16? I just got asked for this. I'm not sure what it is. I've done some Googling, and I see things like SOC 2 and PCI, and you know, what are those? How do they fit together? So what I want to be able to do today is sort of walk through how to answer that question so that not only you understand what an SSAE 16 is, but also why your clients are asking, and even probably more importantly to you, how could it impact or help our business. So let's go ahead and kind of get into the program. I want to tell you a little bit about us. And we are a CPA firm. We are specialized in information security and compliance auditing. So as a CPA, we actually don't perform financial auditing. We focus in on SSAE 16, SOC 2. We are a PCI QSA, so if you've been asked about the payment card industry standard as well, we issue certifications there and help clients prepare for FISMA as well, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So one of the things that we also do is help companies prepare for audit. So that's a big part of our process there. So helping you prepare and doing the readiness so that you're prepared and successful in the audit as a phase 2 step. So when as I walk through the program, I'm going to put on that auditor hat, kind of share with you from an auditor perspective what are these things, but feel free to ask us additional questions either in the webinar today using the Q&A feature, or you can follow up with us via email or phone later, and that's certainly fine as well. So let's get into the core of our topic today. So I refer to all of these audits as the alphabet soup. You know, that's SSAE 16, SOC 2, you may be familiar with SAS 70 or HIPAA, PCI, FISMA, and they're all acronyms. So, you know, what do they all mean? So let's get started. Kind of making sense of this alphabet soup. So let me give you some brief history here, because understanding what's driving it, I think will help you understand where your client is coming from. So in 1996, most of you are probably aware that the HIPAA legislation was enacted, which essentially mandates the protection of PHI, protected health information. So you know, as a printer, if you're receiving if you're printing statements for the medical industry, for instance, you know, involved in the claims process or billing process in any way, you're certainly going to get asked about that. In 1999, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act was enacted, which requires banking to protect personally identifiable information and have adequate control. In 2002, Sarbanes-Oxley was enacted, which mandates the protection of public financial statements. So if you're a publicly traded company, anyone that has an impact on your financial statement or handles your financial information, you have an obligation to ensure it's protected adequately. So then in 2002, the FISMA Act, Federal Information Security Management Act, again, which requires the protection of federal data with certain controls. And then in 2004, the payment card industry itself banded together, created a standards council, and issued a standard that requires all payment card information to be protected. So if you're handling credit card information, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express are the primary ones, you know, you're going to get asked about PCI. So what's unique about all legislation and the privately mandated standard PCI that you see here is that all of these standards require the entity to not only have adequate internal controls in place, which we mean policies and procedures when we say internal controls, they all require that you ensure that your third-party vendors, or I'm sorry, they ensure that their third-party vendors, a la you as the printing organization, also have adequate internal controls in place. So if you're working with a publicly traded company or a bank like a credit union or the federal government or even a state and local, that they're being mandated by legislative requirement to ensure that you as the printer have adequate internal control. And so it's that legislative background that is driving the request for the SSAE 16 and other audit formats mentioned here. So that's why they're on the phone with you and why they're asking for those particular things. So let's go ahead and look at what's appropriate. So again, the law requires that they validate that you have adequate internal control. You do have they have a couple of options. They can either audit your location, your facility, your operation themselves to validate you have internal control, which means they have to send their own auditors on site and validate it. You may have gotten questionnaires, for instance, if you work with banks. That's their attempt to validate you have internal control. The law allows that, or the law says you have to have an appropriate third-party audit performed to validate that. So the question is, well, what's appropriate? What meets that legislative requirement from a third-party audit perspective? And the answer is this alphabet soup, the SSAE 16 being the most commonly used means of third-party audit to validate that a third party has adequate internal control to meet the legislative requirements we just talked about. But some of these others are commonly used in certain circumstances as well. So let's start breaking that down by audit type. So SSAE 16, so let's start there. And I mentioned this is the most common means of attestation in the U.S. And so you're going to hear this probably more often than anything else unless you're working with a specific client type. So publicly traded companies all leverage SSAE 16 to meet their Sarbanes-Oxley requirement. Financial institutions, both traditional and non. So when I say traditional, you think banks, credit unions, but non-traditional would be mortgage companies, mortgage, even brokers, that sort of thing. So investment banking. So if you're working with investment bankers, again, all of those will highly rely on the SSAE 16, and state and local government do as well. So if you're working primarily in the private sector for small and medium-sized businesses, you may not ever hear SSAE 16. But if you're working in any of these realms or working for someone who does, you know, you'll hear about SSAE 16, and you'll be blocked from those markets without it. So we'll start there with a key piece. So let's look at some of the others. So SOC 2 is the audit framework that is also utilized by publicly traded companies, financial institutions as well. It's just being slowly adopted. It was created in June of 2011, so we're going on 4 years here this month that it was enacted, and so it's slowly being adopted. It's just not as common. So the focus here for SOC 2 is for technology companies, idea of data center software providers. So is so you may hear SOC 2 much less likely than SSAE 16. So if you're being asked for HIPAA, it's because you handle protected health information. So if you're working with a healthcare provider or those that service the healthcare industry, you're going to hear about HIPAA. HIPAA is all about protecting that healthcare data. And that is not limited to public companies or private companies. Anyone who handles healthcare data is mandated and covered under HIPAA. So that one would be across the board. That could be a small or large entity. All are equally required to validate HIPAA compliance. So we mentioned PCI earlier. If you're printing credit card statements or you're printing customized variable data marketing to be inserted in credit card statements, or are receiving credit card data in order to do customized marketing based on purchase history, et cetera, you're likely to get asked for a PCI audit to validate your compliance to the PCI standard. In FISMA, I mentioned it earlier, but if you do work with the federal government or a contractor for the federal government, you're going to be asked to be FISMA compliant. And I will say that FISMA is the most robust information security framework of the ones we're talking about today. So it's fairly safe to say that if you pursued FISMA compliance and were effective in pursuing that the other audit types that we find listed here are somewhat less complicated than that. It would be downhill from there, if you will, in terms of effort. So that's what FISMA compliance would allow you to do. So let me get a little bit more specific about what an SSAE 16 is. So it kind of helped you understand why they're asking. We kind of looked at who asks, but what is it? So an SSAE 16 is an audit and report on the internal controls that you have at your organization. And when I say internal controls, think policies and procedures, the things that you do to protect your client's data. So it does have to be performed by a CPA. Not just anyone can perform an SSAE 16. The key here with SSAE 16 is that the controls that we look at are related to how you protect your client's data. We are not concerned about your data as an organization. So your employee data, your financial statements are not relevant to SSAE 16. The controls that we look at, even financial reporting controls, are related to how you impact your client's financial statements, not your financial statements. So when we audit, we'll be looking at things like physical security or administrative security, like background checks on new employees, for instance, would fall into that category. We'll also be looking at technical security, like things like antivirus and firewalls and password policies and things like that. All of those things related to how you protect your client's data. Now, what's unique about SSAE 16 and why you will get very frustrated if you Google SSAE 16 requirements and you will not find a good list. And the reason for that is that SSAE 16 is actually a flexible audit format. What that means is that there is no preset standard set of requirements. The SSAE 16 is risk-based. So essentially the way SSAE 16 works is you look at the service that you provide your client and you say, what are the risks, the unique risks because of what we do to our client? And once you understand what those unique risks are, then you put controls in place to mitigate those risks. And then it's the auditor's job to validate whether those things are in place and operating. So it's all focused on the risk. So generally speaking, you do need to work with an audit firm that has a good understanding of what is involved in SSAE 16, has enough experience to understand what your clients will need to see in your SSAE 16 report, and kind of guide you to put those best practices in place that ultimately your client would be expecting to see given the nature of the service that you provide. So what do we commonly report on in an SSAE 16? Well, I mentioned those physical security controls, administrative security controls. I mentioned background checks, employee security awareness training annually would be an example. And I mentioned technical security. It's also used commonly to report on controls that impact your client's financial reporting. So if there's some financial aspect to the service you provide, how you do that to ensure that that is accurate may also be included in SSAE 16. We mentioned information security could be regulatory compliance controls, like HIPAA is a good example. The controls that you have in place to make sure that you're meeting the specific HIPAA requirements could go into an SSAE 16. And then maybe contractual requirements. Maybe you have a client that requires you to have an annual vulnerability scan or quarterly vulnerability scan performed on your network, or maybe they require you by contract to have an annual penetration test performed. Then that would be a control that's listed in your SSAE 16 report, and then as an audit firm, we would audit to validate, A, you're either doing the quarterly vulnerability scanning or you've had an annual pen test conducted exactly, and so on and so forth. The key with SSAE 16, when it really boils down to it, it's ultimately a report that says you do what you say you do. So an SSAE 16 report, if you've ever read one, will describe everything the company is doing. That's the description of control. So here is what we say we do. And then the bulk of the audit report essentially documents, are they doing what they said they're doing? And is what you say you do reasonable? Does the auditor agree that these controls are good controls? They're effectively designed to accomplish what you said you're accomplishing. So if you said we prevent unauthorized physical access to the building and you don't have any locks on your doors, we would say it's not reasonable, right? As an example, but so again, the auditor also has to attest to the fact that they're reasonable. So there are two types. There is a type 1 and a type 2. This is another common question I get, Todd. What is a type 1 versus a type 2? Now, it is common for your client to ask you for an SSAE 16, but not specify whether they want a type 1 or a type 2. Generally speaking, if the client's not specifying a type 1 or type 2, what that will indicate is a type 1 will be satisfactory for them. But if you have a client specifying type 2, for instance, you'll know what type you need to perform. So the difference between a type 1 and type 2 is the audit period. So both audits audit the same requirements, meaning the same controls. A type 1 only looks at one day in time. So are these things in place today? If you implemented an information security policy yesterday and you had all the employees sign and read it and sign and acknowledge that they've received it, then today I could issue a type 1 report saying that you have an information security policy that's reviewed annually and is accepted by all employees with written acknowledgement, as an example. As long as it was in place yesterday, I can write a type 1 report today saying that it's in place. A type 2, however, looks at the same exact controls just over time. So generally between 6 months and 1 year. So if the control is we perform background checks on new employees, and in a case of a type 1, we want to see that the program's in place. But in the case of a type 2, we're going to be asking you, how many employees did you hire in the last 6 months? Oh, 3? Okay, show me those 3 files. I want to see that the background check was performed according to your policy. So we're looking at the same exact thing. We're just looking at it more deeply. So that's the fundamental difference between a type 1 and a type 2. Most companies will start with a type 1 and transition to a type 2 sometime in the future. So that's a pretty common scenario. So let me just take a look here at a SOC 2 briefly. So what is a SOC 2? So a SOC 2 also has to be performed by a CPA, but unlike SSAE 16, which does not have a specific set of requirements, it's flexible based upon the industry type and the risk profile. A SOC 2 has a predetermined set of criteria for 5 different principles. So the way a SOC 2 works is you choose your principle. Security is the minimum. You have to do security, but you have the option to add 4 additional principles. That each of those principles have specific criteria that you need to meet. So if you Google SOC 2 criteria, you will find that there's a specific list of controls that you have to meet. And they fit into these categories you see here on the screen. The key thing about SOC 2 that is different from SSAE 16 besides the specific criteria is SOC 2 will require you to monitor your internal controls. So SOC 2 says, have we documented our policies and procedures, number one. Number two, are they communicated to all parties? That includes employees and vendors, third parties, et cetera. And then what do we do to make sure that those controls are happening? So there's some sort of monitoring, some sort of internal audit happening inside the company. That's a key piece. SSAE 16 doesn't require you to monitor your controls. Most people that get an SSAE 16 would rely on an auditor like us who's performing the SSAE 16 to be their validation, whereas SOC 2 requires that you do that, and then we validate that you do that. So a little more in-depth, obviously. So a HIPAA audit is much like an SSAE 16, only focused on PHI, protected health information. But HIPAA legislation specifies you need to have the appropriate physical safeguards, administrative safeguards, and technical safeguards. So you do a risk assessment based upon how you handle PHI, and then you look at what's appropriate, what's the physical, administrative, and technical appropriate safeguards to protect that data. Much of what's covered under a HIPAA audit would also be covered under a SOC 2 audit and would also be covered under a SSAE 16 audit that was scoped for information security. So that would be pretty common. So one of the things that you'll find is that if you're going to conduct an SSAE 16 audit, much of the controls that will be audited are also HIPAA controls. And so it's cost effective. It's way less than double the cost to do them at the same time. Whereas if you did them separately, they're priced pretty similarly because they have similar effort. But when you combine them, because there's so much overlap, there's a good cost savings to do that. So I mentioned FISMA before. FISMA is focused on federal data. Oh, PCI, sorry. Let's do PCI first. So PCI is focused on credit card data. PCI is a very specific information security framework. It has approximately 212 controls under 6 control objectives. There's 12 subject areas. As an audit firm, we're required by PCI to perform 1,000 tests for those 212 controls. So it's very detailed, it's very granular, a lot of effort involved there. More effort involved certainly than SSAE 16, SOC 2, or HIPAA. And then finally, FISMA. So a FISMA audit is a review of the controls that you have in place to protect federal data. So I mentioned earlier that FISMA, the FISMA requirements are the most difficult or the most robust of the audits that we've looked at today. Obviously, a lot of, not very many printers are going to pursue, or at least in my experience, have not pursued this, which means that those that have obviously are uniquely qualified to go after federal business, and those that haven't would be precluded from doing so. So that's sort of an overview of what are these audits, what's the alphabet soup, if you will, of audit frameworks, a little bit about why you would be asked for those, who asks for those, and what is involved in performing those. Before I tell you a little bit about us, I will say, time frame is one of those common questions that I get. How much time does it take to conduct one of these audits? So, I would say that typically for an SSAE 16, a SOC 2, or a HIPAA audit, any of those three, typically we're going to spend 60 days with a client helping them prepare for that audit. So we'll identify the things that they need to do. We'll be available typically over that 60-day period to provide mentoring and guidance and feedback and give healthy direction. And generally, we're spending 30 days worth of audit time. So I would say for a first-time SSAE 16, 90 days is sort of a typical time frame. Some companies might decide, because of their workload and resource load, to spend 90 days preparing and 30 days auditing, and so it could take 120 days, but that's sort of a good time frame and expectation. A PCI audit is way more specific. As I mentioned, there is way more involved in being PCI compliant. It's more common for that to take closer to 6 months to be PCI compliant, just because of the work a client will need to do internally to meet the requirements. Again, that depends on the environment, but realistically, I think 6 months would be a good time frame. So a little bit about us. I'll tell you a little bit about us, and then we'll sort of open it up for Q&A. I know several of you have posted some questions here, and feel free to do that as well here as I open it up for some Q&A. But with Kirkpatrick Price, I will tell you that one of the benefits of working with us is we work with many printing organizations. We have many printing organizations that are current clients, and we do a tremendous amount of auditing. We do have a strategic relationship with Printing Industries MidAmerica, and so you will get discounted pricing to work through the association, but know that we're an organization that is very familiar with the printing industry and works with many printing clients today. We do have dedicated expertise, so our entire focus is on SSAE, 16, SOC 2, HIPAA, these PCI type audits. Most CPAs do not have the expertise to do that. 99% of them perform financial related services, tax related services, et cetera. So again, but all of our expertise is in this area, so we're able to really help you walk through that process. We do use an online methodology that just makes it very efficient. We have an online audit manager tool. The other thing that is very beneficial is if you do need more than one audit, again, we can combine those audits into one process, and so the overall cost of the audit is significantly less, but also the effort internally is significantly less than you would if you had to hire two different audit firms or 3 different audit firms. So tremendous benefit there. So that's kind of a good overview of why you might work with us if you do need one of these audits. So, sir, is there anything else here on our slide deck before we jump into Q&A? We're ready to do that. Okay, great.
We're ready for Q&A, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so I see that some of you have posted some questions. I will go ahead and answer one of the questions that we always get is, will we make this available? And yes, the webinar will be available for review. I think BJ mentioned we'll send out the recording. You will be able to also download the slides themselves. So both of those things will be made available to you post-webinar. So just be looking for the email that will come from Sarah, and she'll have those download links for you. So anyone who has any specific questions, my contact information is here. I'd be happy to answer those questions for you or forward you to the best resource to get those questions answered. So one of the questions I get here is there a certain trigger for a PCI audit? So let me talk about that. So there's a lot of confusion about a PCI audit because there's 2 types. So if you Google what's required for a PCI audit, one of the things that you'll quickly find is 4 merchant levels, for example, and it'll talk about transactions. So level 4 has so many transactions, and it depends on the payment card brand, but you know, there's level 3, level 2, level 1. You know, and a level 1 merchant who is qualified to be a level 1 merchant, you'll see is required to have a third-party certification done. But in most cases, a level 2, 3, and 4 merchant is not. You do not have to hire a PCI auditor. And so a printer will get asked for a PCI certification. They'll Google and they'll say, we don't do 6 million transactions a year. We do 200,000, credit card transactions a year. We don't need a PCI audit. And so there's a confusion there. The confusion lies in the fact that there is another type of PCI certification, which is based on service provider. So there's PCI certification as a merchant, which involves how many transactions you actually have. So you take a customer's credit card number. As a service provider, then there's service provider certification, which is based upon the service that you're providing to your clients. It is not based upon the amount of transactions you have, but rather the data you receive from your clients. in this case, it is highly, it'd be highly unlikely that you would be requested to get a PCI certification because of the number of credit card transactions you do. What is common, however, is that you'd be asked for a PCI certification because your client is giving you credit card data in some data format, either because you're doing variable data printing or statement printing of some sort, and so therefore they're providing some sort of data file to you that has credit card data or they suspect might have credit card data. In that case, that makes you instantly a PCI service provider at that point. Once you become a PCI service provider, you instantly have to be level 1 compliant. Level 1 compliant means you have to have a third-party audit performed. So specifically, what would trigger a PCI audit? A client who sends you a data file with PCI numbers would trigger a full PCI audit for you. And that's where you would see it. Now, I will say this is not as common, but it depends on which industry you work in. Because the PCI data security standard is so well respected, it is a very respected data security standard, it is very specific, it is very robust, it is becoming more and more common, particularly for financial institutions, to require PCI certification, not because they're giving you credit card data, but because they like the standard. And they figure if you can meet the PCI data security standard, then you are very secure, which is a valid, there is validity to that assumption in many cases. So that is not as common, but it is not unheard of. Experian is a good example, which is a credit data company that provides obviously credit data, and they have a specific audit called EI3PA, but the EI3PA audit is simply the PCI requirements. So it is an example of someone who's using the PCI data security standard as their own data security requirement for service providers. So good question. So are there any other questions today that would be helpful for the attendees today? Any last questions that you'd like to ask before we give the time back to you today? And BJ, you as well, as you've been listening, is there any particular questions you've gotten from affiliate members that you think would be helpful for them before we close today?
I don't have any. I haven't seen any other questions here that we haven't been able to answer.
Okay, great.
Maybe people can feel free to send us, they can contact us here at the offices. They can email me if they want to. They can call our offices at 800-788-2040 and ask questions later, because, it's always like after you leave that you got a question. And then you've got your information, your contact information up there. I'm sure people can contact you directly as well. So I don't see anything more in our Q&A box over here, so people aren't typing.
Well, fantastic. Well, I just want to thank you again, BJ, for inviting us, and thank you for those of you who attended today. Hope it was helpful, and we'll give you the rest of the time back, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, and thank you, everybody, for coming.